Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in TradFi, digital assets, technology, and financial planning. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and I'm joined by Christy Wyatt, CEO of Absolute Software. We also have Eric Liebowitz, Chief Information Security Officer at Thales. And then we also have Jud Welle, partner private security practice and complex litigation and dispute resolution practice at Goodwin. And finally, we have Wasim Khaled. He is the co-founder and CEO of Blackbird. We're here to discuss cybersecurity, the impact of brand and reputation, innovation and leveraging AI, and we'll also get an outlook for 2024. It is great to have all of you with us. Thanks so much for joining us on Trade Talks. And Christy, I'd like to kick it off with you. Before we talk about our outlook, leveraging AI, innovation within this space, let's step back for a moment. Where are the biggest targets when it comes to cyber attacks?
Unfortunately, I think that we often overlook the easiest stuff, right? The blocking and tackling and making sure that the perimeter is secure. And so it's not just looking for the bad things that could happen, but it's modeling it all the way out into how do you manage an attack from the beginning to end. So we think about the easy stuff, how do you control passwords, how do you control your network, how do you manage devices. But it's really when we play all the way through, how do we make sure those things are working, and what do we do when one of them goes offline? Those are sort of the unseen parts of cybersecurity that probably get the least amount of attention, but drive a very large number of the attacks that we see out there.
Right, and Eric, it's really about, it's fine, the attack came in, you're trying to figure out ways that you can mitigate it before these attacks come in. Part of it is too, what's the resolution? How do you get from A to Z and effectively communicate this, from the C-suite to the board to your customers? That's really where I guess the success is derived from.
Yeah, I think there's like Christy said, there's a lot to think about when you're talking about cyber attacks. You have to do the upfront work of making sure that you have a solid cybersecurity program. You've brought in all the top talent. You're doing the right things to retain them. But on top of that, you have to understand what the business does and make sure that you're building your cybersecurity program in a way that's not hampering them from doing business, but rather enabling them. And then you have to have that relationship with all of your stakeholders, up to and including your board of directors, so that they understand what you're doing with your cybersecurity program and that they understand it at a level that they continue to fund it and support it.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, the biggest impact, Wasim, is it's your impact to brand, it's impact to the bottom line, but I think brand reputation is, I mean, that's intangible.
Yeah, this has become a bigger and bigger concern of security teams and, of course, CEOs and boards, especially given that you see these narrative attacks that include things like misinformation and disinformation that can shift public perception, and it can massively impact stock price, reputation, and really how people see that organization at large. I think from a cyber perspective, the things that CISOs and security teams really need to think about more is what is their role in how that brand's reputation and the public perceiving how breaches and things of that nature are actually handled and how they handled it. Do they have a read on what that risk factor is and how the public perceives how security teams react?
Just to build on that, and we were talking earlier, right? The brand impact is so much bigger than just the cyber event, right? And we talk a lot about the cyber event and the bad thing that happened and what data left the building. But from the consumer's perspective or the shareholder's perspective, the impact is much bigger than that. How long did it take for business to get back online, for users to be working, for us to be sort of back to normal? And oftentimes that can be much bigger and much more expensive than the actual event itself, and also have the long tail of where a lot of the brand impact is going to happen.
I think Christy's exactly right, particularly because the threat actors are highly attuned to your pain points. And so sometimes it will be stealing data if they can find sensitive data. Other times it will be disrupting your systems.
Exactly.
But they are very adept at finding your weak points and pushing on them very hard, and always with an eye toward monetizing the event.
Right. Well, and Eric, we were talking about this off camera before, but it's one thing to stop the attack, flip the switch. However, that means other parts of the company aren't able to run, and that's when investors start to care. Where, well, if we can't, sell for 2 weeks, or if it impacts our revenue streams, that's, it's all about public perception.
Yeah, and that's where I go back to saying we really need to have a relationship with the business lines and understand what they do and how they do it, so that we don't get into a situation where we're under cyber attack and we just go and pull out all the network cables and turn everything off and say, okay, we've won, we've stopped the cyber attack, but now the business can't function. So we need to understand what they need at a bare minimum to run, what are the most critical systems, we know what to start turning on first once we're at the point where we can recover.
That key word being resilience, right? I was talking to a CISO and they said, we had a horrible ransomware event and we remediated it in 90 seconds or 20 minutes or some ridiculous amount of time. And I said, wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? Well, we told the user to unplug it and put it in a box and ship it back. And I thought, well, okay, so the security, check. Business, right, big X, we failed. So it's about bouncing back and making sure business is back online.
And what are those users going to do when they get upset that all of those things don't work correctly, their software or their systems? They're going to go on social, they're going to go online, and they're going to create noise around it. And whenever you get enough noise around something, you can create some sort of a opening for everyone who has a problem against the CEO, the company, the product, their policy somewhere. Something obscure can go from a single social media post somewhere. It can be amplified by any number of threat actors that have developed tradecraft to drive these narrative attacks, and now you're really on the back foot trying to address all of this.
I think this idea of disruption is the key here, and it's why we're seeing regulators leaning into cyber in a way they haven't before. Prior to 2020, a cyber event was sort of a private event for every company and its customers. But then now, with the rise of ransomware and supply chain attacks and these disruptive attacks that shut down oil pipelines and that can cripple companies and cause people to lose out on their hard-earned investment funds, they find themselves, they're looking to the government to help them. And so what the government has done is to say, companies, you really do have to level up your game. You have to be more mature and think about this wider group of stakeholders, whether it's investors or members of the public. So I think that's why we're seeing over the last year or so enhanced, more robust regulations from a number of different agencies.
Yeah, because cyber attackers are not just going in asking for money. I mean, they're going into like core critical infrastructure, of course your data, which is invaluable to them. I want to talk about the role of the CISO here for a moment. It's no longer under that tech vertical, right? They're working with the board, they're working with the entire C-suite, particularly the CFO, because it's not just a technical position, it's a risk management position as well, probably one of the most critical positions in the C-suite.
Yeah, I think any information security leader has to realize their job is risk management, right? Understanding what the risks are, being able to talk about it at a business level and be able to do that the right way. A lot of times we're stuck as technology leaders and we don't understand the business, and then we go in and try and meet with a business stakeholder, a business leader about what we're doing to protect their business to keep them running, and we get that blank stare because we're talking in a language that they don't understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does, the board has to be involved, C-suite, it does have to be involved, because I've looked at a number of surveys in the course of my cyber reporting, and it is one area where they are not cutting back on spend. R&D might be one area, some other roles might see cuts there, but you can't cut on cybersecurity. I mean, let's talk about this. What if we get a government shutdown? We're in a very heightened geopolitical environment right now. What happens if we get a government shutdown? What happens if these geopolitical events really escalate?
Well, and so, it's about how do you use all of the things you actually have, right? When that day comes, when something is destabilizing us within our organization or outside, right? These are moments theoretically we've prepared for, but we're also not touching on the additional complication, which is a lot of those folks will be remote. So a lot of the playbooks that organizations, including government, have are about what happens when there's some sort of disruption, but we're all on campus, and now we add the additional layer of complexity that everybody is doing this from their home or their living room on insecure networks. So we don't see organizations necessarily pulling back on spend, but we do see them thinking differently about spend. We see them thinking about, how do I make the most out of what I have? It is really common for organizations to have purchased a lot of tools, but not really have great visibility into how many of those are working. Are they using all of the capabilities that they have there? Are they really getting the most out of their investment? And quite the answer is no, right? They have fragmented, or they're using it for one piece and not the most. So while we may not see spend pulling back, we are seeing kind of attention going deeper about, are we getting everything that we need to get out of the investments we've already made?
Are there too many vendors? Is it just there's too much integration that's going on here, and it's almost impossible to keep track of all that? The tech stack is tremendous.
We track how many applications are on a typical device that a user uses, right? And it's well over 100, and I would say for the normal organization, our research would say there's about 12 security applications on every device, but if you go to any large or regulated enterprise, you're going to see more like 20, 30, 40, and those are all of those security layers. I don't envision a world where you're going to see fewer vendors in cybersecurity, because the risk landscape changes so quickly. There's some new attack surface, and there's a tremendous amount of innovation on both sides, both on the bad actor side as well as on the defender side. But we do have to get smarter about managing the complexity on these devices, because it creates this new level of vulnerability where the complexity is kind of working against you. You have too many agents, too many alerts, too many things you have to track. And so while you may have tech installed, you're probably not getting the protection necessarily you need out of it because of the complexity.
You had mentioned the word innovation, and Jud, I want to bring this over to you for a moment and think about this more through the regulatory lens. Two questions for you. Is it challenging for the regulators to keep up because the technology, the velocity of the rate of speed of how much new technology is available? And then the second thing is AI. Do we want to be in front and start thinking about AI regulation and put best practices out there? Do we think, are we at that point?
Yeah, the way I see it is that for the longest time, regulators shied away from imposing prescriptive requirements around cyber. Perhaps they didn't want to stifle innovation. Perhaps they didn't feel comfortable enough from a technical aspect. They're in correction mode right now when it comes to cyber because of the disruptive attacks I mentioned before. They're not making the same mistake when it comes to AI. This is a new emerging technology that companies are racing to leverage, and it's going to have advantages around cyber to defend networks. It's also going to create more capability for the threat actors. But I think the bottom line is that globally, regulators are leaning in to try to put some guardrails in place when it comes to the responsible development and deployment of AI. And so it's uncharted territory, but very early in this process, companies are not only going to have to understand the technology, but the legal risks that are going to come from deploying it.
Right, and Eric, let's talk about that for a moment here, the positive parts of AI and how it's being used with cybersecurity. What are some of the key innovative areas that you're seeing?
So we see a lot of automation coming from AI, right? Things we call threat hunting, where you go through the network and try and identify things that maybe you didn't know were there before. AI certainly speeds that up and makes it more efficient. The problem is, and one of the things that we're struggling with, like the legal point you brought up, Jud, is if I ask AI to do something, write a piece of software to do something I needed to do, who owns that data? Do I own the code, or does the AI vendor who built the product own it? I think that's an area where the governance of AI has a lot of work to catch up to where it needs to be in order to be able to answer questions like that.
I think we're maturing, right? I draw a lot of analogies between AI and what we all learned with open source, right? There's a lot of opportunity for improving productivity and getting further faster, but there's also just a whole new set of learnings about what data is appropriate to go in which systems and IP ownership and how all of this unfolds. And it was a cycle as an industry for us to figure out how to get that right with open source. I think we're going to see that same cycle with AI as well.
I think stitching together a couple of points here around regulatory and AI use. I mean, from a public perception and narrative attack perspective, you've got all of these tools that can be used to generate almost unlimited numbers of narrative and storylines and enable those AI tools to help accelerate how quickly that narrative spreads. Those can be very harmful to an organization. I think in particular, the care that people have to use around the regulatory process is when you're thinking about how much damage an organization can take from a breach. I posed to probably 100 CISOs a question recently that gets some really interesting answers. I'd even be interested in hearing your opinion on this, and that is, what is more harmful to your organization from the perspective of a security team? Is it a breach that occurs where data is exfiltrated and no one really knows about it? Or a completely fabricated breach, let's say AI generated, that has been used to be propagated across networks and everybody knows about this breach that never happened? Right?
Yeah.
And which one is really more harmful? And I get really interesting answers from CISOs all the time on that. And how would you address, say, the SEC, who now sees that and sees something material happening when it was completely fabricated?
Or the third one, right, where I think what people, if it is data-based, then I don't necessarily need to get access to the tool or the network or the organization if I can taint the data, right? And I think that there's an entirely different threat landscape available there, which we've seen on social, we've seen on media, we've seen in other platforms, and now we're going to see it here, where if I can taint the data source, I can disrupt the outcome, and whether that's insecurity or productivity or anything else, right? It's an indirect way to disrupt, which is really what an attack is.
I think what we're coming to the consensus view on is there's going to be these proliferating threats, and it's going to be impossible to do the whack-a-mole approach of anticipate them, equip yourselves to prevent them, right? So the question becomes organizations preparing themselves for the inevitable, right? We will be the subject of misinformation campaign. We will get breached. So do we have the procedures, the governance, the team, do we have the muscle memory practiced to get through this in a mature fashion, in one that mitigates the harm and helps us with the all-important recovery?
Yeah. And investing in kind of the newest technologies to understand some of these attack surfaces that people never really thought about before, that these tools are now creating, that's going to be a really important one, because like with any kind of adversarial attack, there is your defense, which always trails offense capabilities. And without those kind of AI tools to fight the AI tools or things of that nature, you're going to be always on the back foot. So if leaders aren't actively thinking about those attack surfaces, they're going to have these massive intelligence gaps that at some point soon is going to sideswipe them in a very unexpected manner, which we see all the time today. Education
is going to be key. Everything is accelerating, right? And so we have to, all the way from our individual users, we have to educate them about their role in cybersecurity and how they're a vector for attack, all the way to the board of directors to enhance and sort of raise all boats when it comes to this risk awareness and what is my role in the organization to help reduce risk around cyber and some of these related adjacent threats.
Right.
I mean, this might seem like a remedial question. Are we getting better with cybersecurity? Do you think, Christy?
I think we are. In many of the areas we've talked about, including sort of regulation and governance and board visibility, I think we are. But it's like anything. We're on a very, very long journey. So there's a lot of conversation about cyber expertise within the board. But it's a little bit like financial expertise within the board, right? There needs to be some sort of translation that makes it understandable or manageable sort of within that conversation without going into sort of the weeds and we manage that in being able to talk about financial risk through a whole set of tools and processes that we all use as organizations. I'd say on cyber, we're not there yet. We're all sort of still building the pieces. So we don't have that common framework about how to have the conversation that drives the education, that drives the incident management. If I think of the three pillars, right? If we think about detection and prevention, what bad things could happen, we're so much better than we were, but new bad things are always being invented. If we're in the bucket of, are we making the investments responsibly as organizations to prevent those bad things from happening? Again, I would say yes. If you look at global cyber spend over the past decade, it's exponentially grown. The third piece, this resilience piece, is the piece that we feel passionately is kind of the piece that we could still go further in regulation, we could still go further in sort of the management compliances because so much of the impact and the damage and the cost is going to be driven after the fact, right? It's in the brand damage, the reputational, it's the getting back to business part. That's where I feel like we still have a lot of maturing to do as an industry.
Yeah.
One of the gaps I think we have is technologists don't speak business and business people don't speak technology. You have to find that crossroad where we get to a point where I could talk at a business level so that a board of directors can understand what I'm saying and that they understand what I'm saying at a level where they recognize where investment needs to be made, because it's a really tricky road to navigate when you're speaking two different languages.
Right.
Cyber is fully a team sport, right? And you have people that are expert in their domain, and then you have other people that are going to enable those teams. But if they're not talking, if they're not sharing perspectives and information, or even worse, if there's a culture where it's resistant, or if there's turf war, really the best teams are the ones that are practicing together. And so that's why companies, mature companies, responsible companies, should be exercising, as I said before, these muscles, these incident response plans, doing these tabletop exercises, and bringing stakeholders from across the company together to really understand how am I going to serve the company best in this crisis moment. Because it's not just going to be the CISO, and it's not just going to be the GC, communications, HR, a whole range of players.
All right, Wasim, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I think that just is an excellent point, because we have seen that maturity starting to happen a bit. I think maybe partially driven by some of the regulatory things that are happening, but for us, the CCO, the Chief Communications Officer, the Chief Risk Officer, they should be working very closely with threat intelligence and security teams, because without that collaboration, you're never going to be able to tie all of those risk signals together and be able to get ahead of this problem and be able to mitigate it in a very high fidelity, high speed way, which is what things require, because everything moves at the speed of social now, and that's where the damage comes from often in the end.
All right, Wasim, Jud, Eric, and Christy, we appreciate your insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from the MarketSite studio in Times Square, New York City. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.